Chapter 18. Night had fallen long ago. Shadows stretched across the streets, punctuated by pools of light from the cold fire torches as they made their way back to the manticore. Pierce had slung his bow across his back and was carrying his long flail. The chain swung slightly as he walked. He found the motion was relaxing, steady, predictable. "It was nice to meet a few friendly faces," Lay said. "Some a little too friendly, if you ask me," Dane grumbled. "I'm not so sure about that," Jode said. "What do you mean?" "Hugo. He'd seen Raciel before. I'm sure of it. I was watching him, and there was a definite reaction." "Interesting," Dane said. "We'll track him down in the morning. Pierce, are you all right? You didn't say a word at dinner." Pierce raised his flail, causing the chain to wind around the haft. "There seemed little to say, Captain, though I wonder at Greykill's words. If she believes that it is a mistake for you to wear your uniform, because it is a symbol of the war, what am I to do?" Pierce had been built to serve in the Syrian military, and the symbols of his service were engraved into his torso. "War is my purpose. If the world must forget the war, what place is there for me?" Even the usually glib Jode had no answer for this. "Your place is with us," Lay offered. Pierce inclined his head, acknowledging the thought, but he wasn't so certain. He heard of a stranger's words echoing in the back of his mind. "Are you just a weapon, worthless when there is no blood to be spilled?" They followed the street around a tight curve as it followed the wall of the central tower. Around the bend, 6 people were spread across the street. In the dim light, they all appeared human, though their features were hidden by ragged cloaks and cowls. The man in the center pulled back his hood. It was Monin, or Hugo. Pierce had noticed that the two had a few unique quirks. Hugo seemed to speak more often and more quickly, and Monin had a tendency to fidget. Give it time, he was confident he could distinguish between the two. But at a glance, he wasn't sure which one they were dealing with. "I suppose we could have that talk now," Dane said. The 6 figures rushed forward. Monin brandished a long knife, and one young woman had her hands outstretched like weapons. Pierce saw that her fingers were tipped with long, curved claws. "Take them alive if you can," Dane cried. As Monin closed with Dane, the woman and another stranger charged Pierce. He raised his flail and dropped into combat consciousness, setting aside emotion and thought to rely on the battle instincts that were a part of his being. 2 foes, a human male, middle-aged, overweight. Features twisted in fury, but no visible weapons. No signs of the mystical tools or components that distinguished an artificer or spellcaster. That's 1. A human female, young, athletic, claws. That's 2. Pierce did not question the presence of her talents. He simply evaluated the threat they presented. She was armed, and for the moment, she seemed the greater danger. The captain had requested that they be taken alive. Pierce's flail was already ready and in hand, and even as the woman leapt forward, he swung his weapon in a low arc, wrapping the chain around her ankles. He gave a mighty pull. She fell back with a snarl, slamming her head against the street. Pierce was moving forward even as she fell, lashing out with the haft of the flail. But even as he struck her across the face, agony lashed across his shoulder. In a split second, he replayed the scene in his mind, reviewing the attack. As he engaged the young woman, the older man had jerked his head forward and let loose, with a stream of bile, a gout of acid, that was now eating into the metal plating and composite material of Pierce's shoulder. Pierce was no creature of flesh and blood. He did not cry out, but he did still feel the pain, a terrible burning that warned him of the injury he had suffered. Priorities had changed. The portly man was a threat after all, and it was impossible to guess what other powers he might possess. Pierce disentangled the flail's chain from the woman's legs and raised it as the acid spitter charged. His attacker took in a deep breath. Pierce crouched and pulled his flail back to strike. The man's mouth opened, and he turned to stone. One instant the man was in motion. A second later, he was a granite statue. There were still flecks of bile on his lips, and the acid began to pit the stone. The clawed woman was rising to her feet, judging he had 2 or 3 seconds to spare. Pierce glanced over his shoulder. The Lady Lay was on the ground, struggling with an old woman. From the strain on her face, it was clear that the crone was far stronger than she appeared. At the start of the battle, Pierce remembered seeing rags wrapped around the woman's hands. Now, one of her hands was free, and Pierce caught sight of a blemish on her palm, a scar or tattoo that resembled a large reptilian eye. "Pierce! Watch out!" Lay called. "Don't look at her left hand." With the threat identified, his course of action was clear. The clawed woman had regained her feet and was charging him. Pierce hurled his flail at her. She dodged the clumsy attack with ease, but it bought Pierce enough time to turn and grapple with the crone, pinning her. Her strength was unnatural, but Pierce had muscles of steel and stone. As the taloned woman came forward, Pierce twisted, bringing the old woman's hand up like a shield, and a moment later there was a second statue in the middle of the street, claws outstretched in a frozen frenzy. "Assist the others," Pierce called out to Lay. He struggled with the crone and slowly brought her hands together. She hissed in a fury and redoubled her struggle. He brought his massive metal foot down on one of her rag-wrapped feet. She gasped, her eyes widening in pain, and he forced her left palm up to her face. The old woman turned to stone, frozen forever, as she stared at her own third eye. Dane couldn't bring himself to strike a fellow Sirren, no matter how strange these people seemed to be. Monon had no such scruples, and he slashed at Dane with his long knife. Dane parried the blade, but even as he did so, a raking pain blazed across his back. He stepped sideways away from Monon and turned. A filthy dwarf, with a vicious light in his eyes, was right behind him. There was blood on his hands, and vicious talons protruded from his fingertips, and the strange, twisted musculature of his arms. "Flame!" Dane cursed, dodging another of Monon's blows. "What are you people?" Monon laughed, and both enemies charged. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his back, Dane held the dwarf at bay while lashing out with a powerful kick. He caught Monon in the chest, and the twins staggered back, giving Dane a moment to focus on the dwarf. His foe moved with unnatural speed, smashing Dane's hand and knocking his sword from his hand. The dwarf pressed forward, lashing at Dane's leg with his claws. Dane gasped and fell to one knee. While he hated the thought of striking one of his own, there was no choice. The dwarf would tear him apart. With his free hand, Dane reached out and grabbed the first thing he could, the beard of the feral dwarf. He yanked forward as hard as he could, and the unexpected indignity caught his foe off balance. Even as the dwarf swept forward, Dane brought up his dagger and buried it in the dwarf's throat. With a gurgle, the dwarf staggered back, claws scrambling ineffectively at the knife buried in his neck. Even as Dane rose to his feet, Monon was upon him, and now Dane was completely disarmed. He leaped out of the path of Monon's blade and tried to spot his fallen sword. Monon continued to laugh, and the sound seemed to echo in Dane's head, an unnatural reverberation that drowned out all natural thought. His vision blurred, and it seemed as though there were a dozen Monons dancing before him. A blade lashed out, and it was all he could do to catch it with his forearm. Pain lanced through him. The blade flashed in the light of the cold fire, and through the drowning laughter they knew the end was near. A shadow flew past. The statue of the old woman smashed into Monin, slamming him down to the ground with a crunch of bone. Struggling to stay on his feet, Dane saw Pierce approaching. The Warforged had hurled his petrified foe at Monin. As Dane's head began to clear, he grabbed Monin's fallen knife and put his foot on the twin's chest. Lay, Pierce, and Jode spread out around him. "It's over, Monin," Dane said. "Tell me what this is about, and I'll get you to a healer." Monin continued to cackle, but his mouth was full of blood. Dane slapped the man hard. He grabbed Monin by the throat and brought the dagger into view. "Don't make me hurt you, Monin." The twin laughed again, his voice a little weaker this time. "It's Hugo," he whispered, and then Dane's mind exploded. Dane staggered back. Wave upon wave of alien thoughts assailed his mind. A lifetime of memories, an overwhelming flood of images and sensations were trying to burrow their way into his brain. He fell to his knees, trying to raise his own memories as a defense. His grandfather, shouting at his father. That last time he'd seen Alina 10 years ago, the attack at Whitehearth. "Ah, I know my name," he said, and for a moment, he believed it. Chapter 19. He was lying on a blanket in a bare, dusty room. A small man, a halfling, was sitting next to him. Somewhere bells were ringing. "Are you well?" the little man said. Jode. This was Jode. Slowly, memories came back to him. "Jode?" he whispered. "You're all right." Jode shrugged. "Fine. They didn't seem that interested in me. The man who came after me wasn't even armed. And after I put a knife through his knees, he seemed happy to leave me alone. How about you? Can you remember what happened?" I think so." "Apparently, Monin, Hugo, whoever, destroyed his own mind, and you were caught in some sort of psychic backlash." Jode studied Dane intently. "If you don't mind my asking, can you tell me how we survived the battle at Keldon Ridge?" "Keldon Ridge? No," Dane answered eventually. "None of us can remember what happened." "That's right," Jode said with a relieved smile. "Just checking." "Did you find out what they were after?" "I'm afraid not. All of the others died. Monin, Hugo is still alive, but he's not responding to anything." "I see." "It's worse," Jode said. "He's a changeling. He reverted to his true form after he collapsed." "Changeling?" "So it may have been Monin, it may have been Hugo, or it may not have been either of them. There's no way of knowing until we find the other twin." Dane rose up to a sitting position. "Are the others all right?" Olandra smiles. "I've healed your back and Lay patched up Pierce. They're downstairs having breakfast. We thought it best to let you sleep as long as you needed." Since the last thing he could remember was eating dinner, Dane was surprised to find that he was hungry. He looked around and found his clothes. "We should stay together from this point on. I don't know why we were attacked, but clearly something strange is going on in High Walls." "Stranger than you think, Captain. But I think I'd better let Lay explain." "A basilisk's eye?" "I think so." Lay was enjoying another bowl of the Manticore's legendary gruel. "Once she'd been petrified, it was safe to examine it. I think someone somehow
embedded a basilisk's eye in the palm of her hand, keeping all the abilities of a true, living basilisk.
So this wasn't the Tarkanans.
Assuming the people we met yesterday were telling the truth, there's nothing familiar about the two. Baal's powers are based on the same principles as a dragon mark. These others, I've never seen anything like it.
After you collapsed, that other captain, Greykill, showed up with a few members of the local militia. She took us to the healer, Hulda, along with the other bodies. There wasn't much room in her tent, so we brought you back here once we knew it was safe. With the exception of the changeling, Greykill knew who all of the attackers were, Jode said. It could have been an act, but as far as I could tell, she really was surprised and disturbed by what she saw. She claimed to have no idea or why they would do what they did.
Well, we're getting to the how, they continued. Those two with the claws, we extracted some sort of creatures from their arms. They looked like worms of some sort. Given the mental powers of the changeling, I think that these worms were linked to their minds somehow. It's possible their sinews were even controlling their behavior. In any case, I've heard of Kalashtar adepts who can use the powers of their minds to reshape their bodies, and I think that's what this was. These worms increased their strength and speed and produced those claws. The petrification makes it impossible to tell, but I'm guessing that the old man who spat acid at Pierce had a similar graft. Some monstrous organ implanted in his chest.
So you're saying we're looking for a man with a deadly touch, and we're being chased by people who have been physically altered to spit acid and turn people to stone.
That's about right.
Doesn't anyone use swords anymore? Dane slumped in his chair. I'm beginning to miss the war. Greykill is keeping the changeling under watch in case he recovers, Jode said. I need to go heal some of the local children, so if you want to talk to her about the people who attacked us, we can see what she knows. Clearly, we need all the information we can get. Dane paused for a moment. Do you think that it could have simply been a random attack? That we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time? After all, they didn't ask for anything. I suppose. On the other hand, Monin did seem to recognize Raciel, and I can't help but wonder if the attack was related to the dinner conversation.
Perhaps we were asking too many questions, and someone wanted you dead. Or maybe, Lay said thoughtfully, maybe someone wanted you alive.
What do you mean? Jode said.
You said it yourself, Jode. You're the only one they didn't try to kill, even after you injured your enemy. Perhaps they didn't expect the rest of us to last as long as we did. Once we were down, the attackers could have teamed up to subdue you.
But what would they gain? But what would they want with me? Jode said.
That is the question, Lay said.
So, where do we go from here? Dane tried to collect his thoughts. To begin with, you don't go anywhere alone, especially in high walls. Let's talk to Greykill and see what she knows about our attackers. After all, well, we still need to talk to the wind, whatever that means. Lay clutched her forehead.
Sovereign Lords, I'd completely forgotten about that. Do you think we'll have to fight the guard again?
There's only one way to find out. Chapter 20. Greykill met them at the Siren Infirmary in Togren Square. The floor of the tent was lined with pallets, and people of all ages were spread out across the floor. The smell of blood and gangrenous flesh was strong in the air, and moans of low cries filled the chamber. Most of the patients were veterans of the war. Some were recovering from physical injuries, but others were victims of magical attacks or the mourning itself. One man was missing his right arm and leg. It seemed as though his right side had been transformed into wax and then exposed to tremendous heat. A young woman was sitting up and gesturing with her right hand, making the same complex gesture over and over again, but her eyes were vacant and blank. Grekel stood in the back of the tent, looking down at an immobile figure with dead white skin and lank silver-gray hair, the changeling. "Good to see you up and about, Dane," Grekel said, looking over at him. "So far, no signs of life from our friend here. Hulda took another look at him this morning. Unfortunately, it's hard to tell if he's just playing possum." "I can try to do something about that," they said. Her ability to channel and weave magical energy was limited, but after a good night's rest, she was ready to get back to work. "Do it," Dane said. They produced a small disc of polished red marble from her belt pouch. An eye was engraved into the surface, and Dane was reminded of the symbol of the pommel of his borrowed sword. They traced the lines of the eye, whispering incantations, and after a moment the eye began to glow in the wake of her touch. A minute later, she was done. "Shall I?" she asked, looking at Dane. He nodded, and she held the stone above the changeling's head. She closed her eyes, reaching out to study the surface of the changeling's mind. Eventually, she opened her eyes again. "Nothing. He's completely empty. There are no thoughts left at all." "Keep at it," Dane said. He turned to Grekel. "Jode told me that you knew the people who attacked us. Can you explain any of this?" Grekel shook her head. "Not at all. Philan, the fat man, now the fat statue, just the other day he was out in the market telling the children stories of Seer. Saris, the woman with the claws, served as a scout under my command. Overzealous, maybe, but I never saw her claws before." "Did they know each other?" Jode asked. "Everyone here knows each other," Grekel said. "But did they spend much time together? Not that I know of." "What about the other twin?" Dane said. "Have you found him?" "Not yet. But Dane, you're dealing with a changeling. This may not have anything to do with Hugel and Monin. They could be as innocent as you or I. Or there may never have been a Hugel or Monin. My guess is that one has always been a changeling, and the other is human," Jode said. "Changelings aren't inherently evil, but few people trust them." "I can't imagine why," Dane said. "They're just people, Dane. This Monin could have met Hugel at an early age. They took a liking to one another and decided to be brothers. It's not that uncommon, from what I hear. I've heard that other changeling communities have a set of identities that they share. So, you could have 6 changelings who take turns being Lay, Jode, or Dane. Or Hugel or Monin." "Exactly," Dane scowled. "So, Grekel, you don't know anything about this. What these people were up to, or why they might have attacked us?" "Well," she pondered a moment before continuing, "if you assume it was Monin you were dealing with, there are a number of factors to consider. You are all members of the Siren army, but so am I, and I haven't been attacked yet. Your companion has the mark of healing,
Speaking of which, Jode, would you mind helping Hulda over there? She's got 4 more cases of flameworm fever. And then there was that friend of yours from the sketch. I'm putting my money on one of the last 2. So, seeing as I've taken it on myself to maintain order in high walls, would you like to tell me what that's really about?
What do you mean?
She tapped her good eye. Only half blind, Dane. Your Jode is a smooth talker, but I don't believe that second cousin story for a minute. The way I see it, either Monin and his strange friends were working with this racial and were trying to protect him from you, or they want him dead, and you happen to be more convenient. You want to tell me about it? And while you're at it, she turned to look at Lei, who was sitting quietly with her eyes closed. You want to tell your friend here to stop trying to read my mind? If you've got questions, just ask.
Dane blushed and tapped Lei on the shoulder. She blinked and dropped the carved stone.
She's telling the truth, she said. I could have told you that for free,
Greykill grumbled. All right, Captain Greykill. But I'm not comfortable talking here. Come back to our room at the Manticore, and I'll tell you what we know. Greykill grinned.
Sounds good. I've always wanted to try their gruel. I hear it's top-notch.
Dane shrugged. I don't know. I've had a lot of gruel in my day, and honestly, it's just fair.
Aberrant dragon marks, Greykill frowned. As in, eat your candied jask roots, or the Lady of the Plague will steal you away in the middle of the night?
Dane nodded. You said you'd seen Raciel talking to Hugel and Monin, right?
I think so, but it's just a vague memory. A discussion in the marketplace maybe a week ago?
That might be about right. Raciel was supposed to be transporting contraband goods for my employer. He returned with the goods 2 days ago, but never made his delivery. I wonder if he was working another deal on the side.
Or 2, Jode commented. The Turkanan seemed eager to find him. It may just be family bonds, or there could be more to it. What was the delivery? Some sort of rare dragon shards. But none of the attackers had dragon marks, Greykill said. What possible good could the shards do for them? Different types of dragon marks have different purposes, Lei explained. These are Kyber dragon shards, and they can bind the energies of dragon marks and other sources of magical power. Thinking about it, I can see the value. I don't know how, but someone seems to have woven unnatural abilities into these people, the same way I can place enchantments into objects. Perhaps these dragon shards can streamline the process. If the dragon shard was grown up and suspended in a liquid medium, I don't know. It's all theoretical. Is there a skilled artificer in the community, Greykill? Or possibly a transmuter? Sure, Greykill said. Old Joel, who lives in the tent with all the holes in it and wears his skillet as a hat. No, we don't have a skilled artificer around. Do you think the place would look such a mess if we did? What about the woman with the basilisk eye in her palm? How did that happen? Well, old Hilla was a war widow, and lost both her sons in battle as well. I remember having dinner with her at Terrell's a few months back. She was surprisingly energetic and spent most of the time complaining about Brilland feeding us table scraps after destroying everything we have. I remember arguing the point with her. As I was saying last night, it's not going to do any good to hold on to that sort of anger. And then she turned you into stone? Jode said. No, and I'm certain her hands were normal then. She's a seamstress. I remember seeing her with that bandage a few weeks ago, but I assumed that she'd cut herself in work. This troubled Dane. So much for this being an effect of the morning. So you're saying that some time over the last month, she had a basilisk's eye stuck in her palm. He looked at Lay. I know they say if you can buy it in Sharn, but I didn't realize that extended to living body parts. I've never heard of such a thing, Dane. What about that girl with the stone teeth? Could the two be related? I wouldn't think so, said Lay. I've never seen such a focused, petrifying effect before. There's no connection, Greycow said. I met Eulalia the first time I had dinner with Terral, and that was almost 4 months ago. I think she really is a casualty of the morning. We've seen a lot of horrors come out of our homeland. There are at least 6 people in the infirmary in far worse condition than she is. Jode, you seem to be the expert on changelings. They reshape their own bodies, right? Could a changeling twist someone else's body? Plant a basilisk's eye in Hilla's hand? No, Jode and Lay answered at the same time. They looked at each other, and Lay continued. Changelings have a very limited ability to shift their appearance. A changeling couldn't even place a functioning eye in its own palm, let alone an eye with magical powers. It's like dragon marks. A changeling can place the design of its skin, but it doesn't actually get the powers of the mark. All right, Dane rubbed his forehead. Let's go over this one more time. We've seen a group of people in Sharn with aberrant dragon marks, which channel dangerous energies. One member of this group is a former guardsman who can kill people with a touch. He starts working behind the back of his new friends. In the process, he begins dealing with either Hugel or Monin, who may or may not have been a changeling at the time. Monin, if it was Monin, has his own group of friends, the acid-spitting Extra Eye and Claw Club. We have dinner last night. Monin discovers that Jode has the mark of healing, and that we are looking for Raciel. He proceeds to gather together a group of his friends and attacks us. But why? Lay spoke up. Raciel may not have anything to do with it, actually. Clearly, these people are twisting their bodies in unnatural ways. That's got to be dangerous work. She looked over at Greykill. Have there been any mysterious deaths recently? Disappearances, certainly, but it's not the safest place or time to be in Siryn. Implanting monstrous organs. I imagine that for every working basilisk eye, you could end up with a corpse. Whoever is doing this may simply have wanted Jode's services to keep their subjects alive. The real question is, how many more of these people are out there? Did we encounter all of them last night? Or are there more? I imagine Hugel could tell us that, Dane said. We're looking for him, Greykel said. The Sharn Watch tends to ignore us. Either we are not worth their time, or they're afraid to enter the district. Believe what best suits your ego, but I've pulled together a few friends to help maintain order. We'll see if we can turn him up for you. Thank you, Captain Greykill. I told you, I'm done with that. And don't think I'm doing it for you. I just don't want anything happening to Jode while we've still got Flameworm going around. She laughed and struck Dane on the shoulder. How about you? Any ideas? Only one. He looked over at Lay. Ready to go back to Malian's Gate?